My name is Deanna Westbrook, and I am 33 years old, and 72 hours ago, my mother called me at 2 in the morning and said your brother's been arrested and we need $50,000 for bail by Friday, or he stays in county. Lock up until his trial. And I sat up in bed and I looked at my phone screen showing her name and I said, "Okay, Mom," and she said, "Okay, you'll help," and I said, "No." "Okay, I heard you." And she said, "Deanna, we need you," and I said, "You've never needed me before." And I hung up and I turned my phone off and I went back to sleep. And right now, at this exact moment, it is Thursday afternoon, which means my family has 14 hours left to come up with $50,000. And based on the 17 missed calls and 9 voicemails I got when I turned my phone back on this morning, they have not found it and they are panicking. And I am sitting in my living room drinking tea, watching the clock run out. Because for the last 18 years, every time, my family had something worth showing up for. They told me I probably wouldn't want to come. And now that they need me to show up, I've decided they're right. I don't want to. Let me take you back to 72 hours ago, because the timer started the moment my mother's call came through. And you need to understand that this wasn't the first time my family assumed I'd be there when it was convenient for them. This was just the first time the stakes were high enough that my absence would cost them something they couldn't replace. Hour 1, it's Monday at 2:14 in the morning, and my phone is ringing, and I answer it half asleep, and my mother's voice is shaking, and she says, "Deanna, your brother Ryan has been arrested." And I say, "For what?" And she says, "A DUI, and he hit a parked car, and there's property damage, and they're holding him on $50,000 bail." And I say, "Is he okay?" And she says, "He's fine, but we need to get him out." And I say, "Okay." And she says, "We don't have that kind of money." And I say, "How much do you have?" And she says, "We can pull together maybe 12,000. And I say, "What about Dad's retirement account?" And she says, "We can't touch that." And I say, "So, you need 38,000. And she says, "Deanna, please." And I don't say anything for a long time, and she says, "You make good money, and I know you have savings." And I say, "Mom, I'm going to think about it." And she says, "Think fast, we have until Friday." And I say, "I'll call you tomorrow," and I hang up. Hour 6. It's Monday morning, and I'm drinking coffee, and I'm thinking about the last time my family needed me, which was never. And I'm thinking about the last time my family invited me to something that mattered, and I'm counting backwards, and the list goes long. My younger brother Ryan graduated high school when I was 21, and I was in college 2 states away, and I called my mother and asked when the ceremony was, and she said, "Oh, Deanna, it's on a Thursday afternoon, you probably can't make it with your classes." And I said, "I can skip class, Mom, when is it?" And she said, "Don't worry about it, it's not a big deal." And I said, "I want to come." And she said, "We didn't order you a ticket, we didn't think you'd want to come." And I showed up anyway, and I sat in the general admission section alone, and I watched my parents and my aunt and my grandparents sit in the reserved family section. And when Ryan walked across the stage, my mother took 100 photos, and not one of them included me. Ryan graduated college 4 years later, and I had a job by then, and I lived 3 hours away, and I texted my mother and said, "When's graduation? I want to be there." And she said, "It's the same weekend as your dad's golf tournament, and we're all going to that instead, so we're skipping the ceremony, but we're throwing Ryan a party the week after." And I said, "I'll come to the party," and she said, "It's family only." And I said, "I am family." And she said, "You know what I mean, close family." And I said, "Got it," and I didn't go and nobody noticed. My cousin graduated med school, and my aunt called my mother, and my mother called me and said, "There's a graduation dinner on Saturday." And I said, "Okay, what time?" And she said, "Deanna, it's a small thing, just parents and siblings. We didn't think you'd want to come." And I said, "You didn't think, or you didn't invite me." And she said, "Don't be sensitive." And I said, "I'm not being sensitive, I'm being excluded." And she said, "If you want to come that badly, I'll ask your aunt." And I said, "Don't bother." And she said, "Suit yourself." Day 2. It's Tuesday morning, and my mother calls again, and I let it go to voicemail, and she says, "Deanna, we're running out of time. Your father talked to the bail bondsman, and we can get Ryan out for 10%, but we still need 5,000 up front, and we're trying to scrape it together, but we're short. And I know you're upset, but this is your brother, and he needs you." And I delete the voicemail, and I go to work, and I don't call her back. That afternoon, my father calls, and I answer because my father never calls, and he says, "Deanna, your mother says you're thinking about helping," and I say, "I'm thinking about a lot of things," and he says, "This isn't the time to be petty," and I say, "Petty," and he says, "Whatever you're mad about, we can talk about it later. But right now, we need to focus on Ryan." And I say, "When have we ever talked about what I'm mad about?" And he says, "What are you talking about?" And I say, "Dad, when's my birthday?" And he goes quiet. And I say, you don't know, do you? And he says, Deanna, come on. And I say, it's November 14th. And he says, okay. And I say, today is November 12th. And he says, so it's coming up. And I say, it's in 2 days, and every year you forget. And he says, we don't forget, we just get busy. And I say, you've never been too busy for Ryan. And he says, that's not fair. And I say, you're right, it's not. And I hang up. Day 3. It's Wednesday. And I wake up to a text from my brother Ryan sent from someone else's phone because he's still in lockup. And it says, Deanna, I know we're not close, but I really need you right now. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. And I just need help getting out of here, and I'll pay you back, I swear. And I read it twice, and I text back, how are you going to pay me back, Ryan? And he says, I'll figure it out. And I say, you've been figuring it out for 10 years. And he says, what's that supposed to mean? And I say, it means you've never paid anyone back for anything. And he says, so you're just going to leave me in here? And I say, I'm going to let you sit with the consequences of your choices the same way I sat with the consequences of yours. And he says, what did I ever do to you? And I screenshot the text, and I send it to my mother, and I say, this is your son asking what he ever did to me. And I want you to think about that. My mother calls immediately, and she's crying, and she says, Deanna, please don't do this. And I say, do what? And she says, punish Ryan because you're mad at us. And I say, I'm not punishing him, I'm just not saving him. And she says, he's your brother. And I say, and you're my mother, and you've spent 18 years making me feel like I'm optional. And she says, that's not true. And I say, Mom, I have been excluded from every major event in this family since I was 20 years old, and every time I asked to be included, you told me I probably wouldn't want to come. And now you want me to come up with $40,000 in 3 days and act like we're close. And she says, we are close. And I say, no. Mom, we're related, and those aren't the same thing. Day 4. It's Thursday morning, and the bail deadline is tomorrow at noon, and my mother leaves a voicemail that says, Deanna, I don't know what else to say. We don't have the money, and your brother is going to sit in jail for months waiting for trial. And this is going to ruin his life, and I know you're angry, but please don't let your anger hurt him. And I listen to it twice, and I call her back, and when she answers, I say, Mom, I need you to understand something, and she says, okay, and I say, I'm not angry, and she says, yes, you are, and I say, no, I'm clear. I'm clear that I've spent 2 decades being treated like a backup option, and I'm clear that the only time you call me is when you need something. And I'm clear that Ryan has never once in his life faced a real consequence because you and Dad have always bailed him out. And she says, so, you're going to let him suffer. And I say, no, I'm going to let him learn. And she says, Deanna, if you don't help him, I will never forgive you. And I say, Mom, you've never forgiven me for existing. And she starts crying, and I say, I have the money. And she says, thank God. And I say, but I'm not giving it to you. And she says, what? And I say, I'm not giving it to you. Ryan can sit and he can wait for trial, and he can figure out what kind of person he wants to be when he gets out. And you can figure out what kind of mother you want to be when you stop calling me only when you need me to fix something. And she says, you're being cruel. And I say, maybe, but I'm also being consistent, which is more than I can say for you. And I hang up and I block her number. Hour 12. It's Thursday night at 11 p.m., and I get an email from my father with no subject line, and it says, your mother is devastated and your brother is scared, and I don't understand why you're doing this, but I hope it's worth it. And I write back, it is, and I close my laptop and I go to bed. Day 5, it's Friday at noon, and the deadline has passed. And Ryan is still in county lockup, and my phone is off, and I'm at work, and I'm in a meeting, and my boss says, Deanna, are you okay? And I say, yes, why? And she says, you seem distracted, and I say, I'm fine. And I am fine because for the first time in 18 years, I have set a boundary that actually held, and I didn't cave, and I didn't apologize, and I didn't light myself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't cross the street to get me a glass of water. 3 weeks later, my mother sends me a letter in the mail because I've blocked her on everything else, and it says, Ryan made bail we borrowed from your aunt, and he's waiting for his court date, and I don't know if you care, but I thought you should know. And at the bottom, she writes, I don't know how to fix this, and I write back on the same letter, and I mail it back to her, and all I write is, you can start by inviting me to things, and she doesn't respond. 6 months later, Ryan goes to trial, and he pleads guilty, and he gets probation and community service and a suspended license. And my mother calls me from a number I don't recognize, and she says, I thought you'd want to know, and I say, okay, and she says, aren't you going to ask how he is? And I say, no. And she says, Deanna, he's your brother, and I say, then treat me like I'm your daughter, and she goes quiet, and I hang up. A year after that, my cousin gets married, and I get an invitation in the mail, addressed to me by name with my correct address and a +1, and I RSVP, yes, and I show up in a blue dress, and I sit at a table with extended family I haven't seen in years, and my mother is at a different table and she keeps looking at me and I don't look back, and at the end of the night she comes up to me and says, "I'm glad you came," and I say, "I'm glad I was invited," and she says, "I'm trying," and I say, "I know," and she says, "Is it enough?" And I say, "Not yet, but it's a start," and she nods and walks away. If you have ever been the person your family only calls when they need something, if you have been excluded and dismissed, and told you probably wouldn't want to, come and then expected to show up with open arms and an open wallet when it's convenient, I need you to hear this. You are not required to save people who wouldn't invite you to celebrate. And you are not cruel for letting someone sit with consequences. And the people who call you selfish for having boundaries are the same people who benefited from you not having any. And the moment you stop being available for crisis and start requiring consistency is the moment you find out who actually values you and who just valued your usefulness.